All right, so you want to really get to grips with these UK net zero carbon building standards. And honestly, who can blame you? It's a pretty big deal for construction, right? We're here to help you navigate this pilot document you sent us without getting bogged down in all the technical jargon. Basically, think of us as your architectural decoders. So to sum it up, the UK has a plan, a net zero carbon footprint for all new buildings by 2050. And this isn't just about, sticking some solar panels on top of skyscrapers. This is about completely changing how we approach existing buildings too. And this document doesn't mess around. It starts by stating that climate science shows that to prevent the worst impacts of climate change, the planet's average temperature rise needs to be limited to 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. So yeah, the clock is ticking, and these standards are all about turning that ambition into action one brick at a time. So who's affected? Well, the standard covers a pretty wide range of buildings. We're talking new office blocks, the homes we live in, schools, hospitals even. Basically, if it's got walls and a roof, it's probably got a place in this net zero revolution.
You know what I find really interesting about this is that even if a building doesn't see its specific sector spelled out in this version of the document, it still kind of extends an invitation. It encourages them to assess their energy usage, their carbon footprint, put it all in a report. It's like dipping their toes into the net zero pool. And that could well lead to them taking the full plunge in future updates to the standards.
So a gentle nudge to the entire industry, like, hey, we see you, and this is the future of building.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. These standards are tailored to the UK's needs and landscape. But there's a clear message throughout the document, these core principles. They're practically designed to be adapted to different countries, different climates, different parts of the world. The potential impact here isn't just local, it's global.
I love it. So we've established that this document is really comprehensive. But let's be honest, sometimes it feels like you need a decoder ring just to understand all the acronyms. Net zero carbon aligned building, net zero carbon aligned building, plus offsets. Why can we get a plain English translation, please?
You're telling me those terms do sound pretty technical. Okay, let's break them down. Net zero carbon aligned building basically means achieving net zero through really carefully considered design construction, how the building is powered and operated, minimizing the environmental impact from day one.
So it's like baking a cake. You can't just sprinkle a few eco-friendly sprinkles on top and call it a day. You have to incorporate sustainability from the very first ingredient.
Exactly. And that's where net zero carbon aligned building plus offsets comes in. It recognizes that even with the best intentions, some emissions are really tricky to completely get rid of. And that's where the plus offsets come in.
So imagine a building that's doing a great job, but there are these emissions they just can't shake. They can then invest in things like planting trees or renewable energy projects in other locations to balance out those remaining emissions.
A good example of that would be a building that can't fit enough solar panels on its roof to meet its energy needs. They could invest in a solar farm somewhere else to make up the difference and hit that plus offsets target.
That makes sense. But before we get lost in the weeds of the specific requirements, let's step back for a second and look at the bigger picture. What are the main takeaways here? What are the big things this standard is pushing for?
Good point. It is very comprehensive and it's easy to get bogged down. Basically, this standard focuses in on a few crucial areas and demonstrates a really holistic approach to tackling carbon emissions from buildings.
Okay, let's hear about some of these key requirements. First up, embodied carbon. I'm guessing this is about more than just choosing energy-efficient appliances.
You got it. Embodied carbon goes much deeper than the energy a building uses on a day-to-day basis. This is about looking at the emissions generated from all the materials used to build it. So that's mining raw materials, manufacturing, transporting them to the building site. It all adds up.
It's like there's a hidden carbon price tag attached to everything. Every steel beam, every pane of glass.
Exactly. And this standard sets limits on embodied carbon emissions, which means builders are going to have to start prioritizing low-carbon materials and more efficient construction methods.
So we're talking about things like swapping traditional concrete for recycled steel or sustainably sourced timber, maybe even using cutting-edge materials with much lower carbon footprints.
Now you're getting it. The message to the industry is clear. The time for innovative and sustainable materials is now.
This is where things start to get really exciting. It's not about sticking with outdated practices. It's about a wave of innovation.
Okay, we've covered embodied carbon. What's next?
Next, we need to look at the operational phase of a building, how efficiently it runs once it's built. And the big thing here is energy use and something called energy use intensity, or EUI.
EUI sounds a bit technical. What does that mean? Think of EUI as a way of measuring a building's energy appetite. It tells you how much energy a building uses per square foot every year. Lower EUI equals a more energy-efficient building. This standard sets specific EUI targets for different types of buildings, which will force them to be far more efficient than they are now. To give you an idea, an average office might have an EUI of 100, whereas one built to this new standard might be as low as 50 or even less. That's a huge reduction in energy consumption.
Wow, so no more energy-guzzling office blocks then.
Not if they want to meet these standards. We're talking about maximizing natural light to reduce the need for artificial light, optimizing heating and cooling systems, and using smart tech that can monitor and adjust energy usage in real time.
So buildings that can adjust their own thermostats. Now that I can get on board with. Now we can't talk about energy efficiency without mentioning renewables.
Absolutely not. Renewables are essential to achieving net zero. And this standard goes all in, incorporating on-site renewable energy generation wherever possible. Think solar panels, wind turbines,
Yeah.
geothermal even.
So it's about more than just reducing energy use. It's about changing how that energy is generated.
Exactly. And it goes a step further than that. The standard sets specific targets for on-site renewables based on the type of building. So, for instance, new homes in Scotland will have to generate at least 60 kilowatt hours of renewable energy for every square meter of building footprint every year.
Wow, that's ambitious.
I like it. It's like they're pushing for all new buildings to become little power stations contributing to a greener grid. That's the general idea. But there's even more to it than that. This standard covers other important aspects of sustainability too, like water use. Obviously, reducing water consumption is a really important part of sustainability, so it's in there.
Of course. Every little helps, especially with water shortages becoming more common.
Then there's the goal of phasing out fossil fuels, especially in new buildings, replacing them with greener alternatives, like electric heating, powered by those on-site renewables we were just talking about.
So tackling both energy consumption and where that energy comes from.
And we can't forget about refrigerants. They might seem like a small thing, but the type of refrigerants used in heating and cooling systems has a huge impact on the environment. This standard encourages a shift towards climate-friendly refrigerants, ones that have a much lower global warming potential.
So it's like the difference between using an old energy-guzzling light bulb and a new efficient LED bulb. A much smaller environmental footprint. I have to say this has been really eye-opening. I'd never even considered half of these aspects of building design before.
Okay, so let's recap. We've talked about the key focus areas embodied: carbon operational energy, on-site renewables, responsible water use, getting rid of fossil fuels, and the impact of refrigerants. Phew, that's a lot.
It's pretty comprehensive, that's for sure. But that's the whole point of this standard. It's about tackling this challenge head-on, approaching decarbonization of the built environment from every angle.
It's like they've thrown out the old rulebook and created a whole new one for building design, one that actually works for a net zero future. Exactly. It's about building better from the very beginning. Now, obviously, there are a lot more details in this document, and it can get pretty specific. But we don't want to overload you with technical jargon. We want you to finish this deep dive feeling empowered, not overwhelmed.
Right, so let's get into those specifics. Stick with us. So you know what they say, the devil's in the details. Let's unpack some of the specifics of this standard that might not be immediately obvious.
Sounds good, because this standard isn't about trying to make every single building the same. It recognizes that a historic building, for instance, is going to have different needs and challenges compared to, say, a brand new skyscraper.
Right, it's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. So how does the standard differentiate between them?
That's where building classifications come in. The standard makes a clear distinction between new buildings and existing buildings, and each one has its own set of requirements.
Right, that makes sense. You've obviously got a lot more flexibility to incorporate new sustainable features if you're starting from scratch.
Exactly. And it goes even deeper than that. We've got new works versus retrofit works, and even reportable works versus non-reportable works. These classifications help to determine exactly which requirements apply to a project, making sure the goals are realistic and achievable.
So it's all about finding the best route to net zero and recognizing that a one-size-fits-all approach just wouldn't work. You mentioned sectors earlier. How does the standard handle the fact that different types of buildings have different energy needs?
Another good point. The standard requires buildings to report different data depending on how they're used. It's not just about hitting a generic energy target. It's about making sure the targets are appropriate for the building.
So a hospital which uses a lot of energy 24/7 wouldn't be held to the same standard as a data center, even if they're a similar size.
Exactly. And there's even more detail than that. The document actually has a table 47, I think it is, that lists all the specific information that needs to be submitted for each sector.
Interesting. So what kind of information are we talking about here?
Well, for example, hotels have to report things like the number of bedrooms and how many nights those rooms were occupied for during the year. Schools need to report the number of pupils. And offices need to report their typical occupied hours and what kind of work they do. Whether it's a traditional office, a call center, a trading floor, that kind of thing. These details all affect how much energy a building uses.
It's like they're building up a picture of exactly how different types of buildings use energy and resources. But with all this data flying around, how can we be sure everyone's being honest? How do we verify that buildings are actually meeting these standards?
That's where verification comes in. And while the document is still being developed in terms of the fine details, the importance of verification is very clear. It's going to involve independent third-party verification to make sure the data is accurate and that buildings are actually meeting the standards.
So no cheating then.
Exactly. Transparency and accountability are key. The specifics are still being worked out, but it'll likely be a multi-step process, starting with an initial assessment during the design phase to catch any potential problems early on, and then a more in-depth verification once the building is up and running to make sure it's performing as expected.
So multiple checks and balances to make sure these standards are more than just words on paper.
Yes, exactly. It's about making these standards a core part of the entire design and construction process, not just an afterthought.
Now, I'm sure some of our listeners are thinking, this all sounds great, but how does this affect me?
Right.
Why should I care about technical building standards?
That's a fair question.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in the technical details. But if we zoom out for a second, we can see that this is about something much bigger than regulations. This is about creating a better future for everyone. Remember those warnings about climate change we talked about earlier? Well, buildings contribute a huge amount to global carbon emissions. So getting this right is essential if we want to tackle the climate crisis.
And it's not just about saving the planet either. These standards could make a real difference to the people who live and work in these buildings. Imagine breathing cleaner air, enjoying more comfortable temperatures all year round, maybe even seeing your energy bills go down. These are all tangible benefits that will improve people's lives.
Exactly. And then there are the knock-on effects. These standards are influencing the future of design and construction, pushing the industry towards sustainable practices that will benefit everyone, not just us, but future generations too.
It's like we're laying the foundation for a more sustainable future.
Exactly. And this is what I find really exciting. I believe these standards will lead to a wave of innovation. That goes way beyond just meeting the regulations. Architects, engineers, builders, everyone will need to think outside the box, to come up with new solutions, experiment with new materials, and ultimately revolutionize how we build.
So it's like these standards are giving the industry a jumpstart.
Yes, and while the UK might be leading the way at the moment, I have no doubt that the innovations and knowledge that come out of this will spread around the world.
Because ultimately this is a global challenge.
Yeah,
And it needs a global response.
exactly. This is about more than just ticking boxes. It's about creating a better future.
You've touched on something really important there. The power of these standards to inspire innovation. And that's something I'd like to explore further.
Let's do it.
I think our listeners are ready for a glimpse into the future of building. You know, it's interesting how these standards are all about the practical side of building, but they also get you thinking about what the future holds. What will these net zero buildings actually be like? What kind of innovations will we see?
It's an exciting thought, isn't it? It often seems like whenever we set ourselves a really ambitious goal, whenever we're forced to rethink how we do things, that's when we get those unexpected breakthroughs.
So let's imagine for a second, what kind of cool new technologies could come out of this net zero building revolution?
Well, for one thing, I think we'll see a lot more bio-based materials being used. Timber, hemp, bamboo. Unlike concrete and steel, those materials actually absorb carbon dioxide as they grow. So we're not just talking about reducing emissions here, we're talking about buildings that are actually carbon sinks.
We've already seen some amazing timber skyscrapers being built, like bringing a forest into the city. But it sounds like you're talking about more than just the materials themselves.
Right. We also need to change how we think about a building's end of life. Imagine buildings designed to be taken apart easily, where the components can be reused. No more demolition, just adaptation and reuse, giving those materials a second life.
Like a giant eco-friendly Lego set. It completely changes what building is, doesn't it? It's no longer a static structure, but something much more adaptable, more connected to nature.
Exactly. And I think we'll see a lot more prefabrication and modular construction happening too, where building components are manufactured off-site in a factory setting, then transported to the building site for assembly. Less waste, quicker construction times, and a smaller carbon footprint.
So it's about streamlining the whole process, making it more efficient. And of course, we can't forget about technology. Smart buildings are already becoming more popular, but how will this push for net zero affect that?
I think we'll see those smart technologies taken to the next level. We're talking sensors, AI machine learning,
Hmm.
buildings that can predict the weather, that can learn from how people use them,
Yeah.
and constantly adjust their own systems for maximum energy efficiency.
Buildings that can practically think for themselves. Maybe not quite, but it's a pretty exciting thought. So, what do you think this means for the future of architecture and construction?
I think we're at the beginning of a huge shift in how we design and build and even live in our buildings. And while this particular standard is focused on the UK, it's going to have a much wider impact.
Because this isn't just a UK issue, is it? This is a global challenge, and we need to share knowledge and work together to find a solution.
Exactly. The UK is setting an example that other countries can follow. The innovations, the data, the
Uh,
lessons learned, it's all going to contribute to a global movement towards net zero.
You've given us a lot to think about, that's for sure. Any final thoughts before we go?
I think the thing that really stands out to me about these standards isn't so much the technical details. It's the ambition, the recognition that we can do better if we're willing to challenge the status quo. This isn't just about reducing our impact, it's about building a future where our buildings are truly in harmony with nature.
Beautifully said. It's been a fascinating journey exploring the UK's net zero carbon building standard. We've talked about the overall goals, the specifics, and even taken a glimpse into the future of building. And remember, the more you know about this, the better equipped you are to make a difference, to advocate for change, to make better choices, and to support a sustainable future. Who knows, maybe one of our listeners will be the one to come up with the next big idea in sustainable building. That's all we've got time for today. Thanks for joining us.